Firelight shone through the square as Anwen stood at the point closest to the end of the village. Various mages stood sentinel around the edges of the open area. Tyler and Walter sat under the eaves of the building they'd waited in earlier. Walker Leslie stood next to them. They seemed to exchange some words, though neither party looked upset. In fact, they almost seemed chummy. Anwen fidgeted. This wasn't her idea of fair, and she just wanted to get it done and over with. And there Tyler was, talking with that woman. It seemed like he didn't have a care in the world. It only served to make her feel even smaller and inadequate than she already did. Why wasn't he comforting her and giving her advice? She could have used it. Takeda shook out her trembling hands. Why had she agreed to this? Oh, right. She didn't have a choice. Not if they were going to prove once and for all that she was who she and everyone else said she was. And until that matter was settled, she doubted the others would listen to them, let alone follow them back to Tarragon to help fight off the revenants, no matter how much they begged. Finally, Leslie stepped away from the protective awning. She moved out onto the hard-packed earth, followed by Sarah. Once there, she signaled for Anwen to meet her halfway across the expanse. The young mage did so with great reluctance. The walker seemed to tower over the fledgling caitiff by a good 5 inches. The difference put her on level with Tyler for height. Too bad she was also much older than Anwen as well, closer to Walter in age. The differences were almost laughable, like a toddler going up against a veteran player. Anwen blew out her breath, trying to mentally prepare herself for this. She had no idea what the older mage would want from her. Would she outright attack her? Hear her out like a schoolteacher checking homework? Or by some other means? The possibilities seemed endless. They only added fuel to the fire for her already frantic imagination. Leslie held her hand up to signal quiet among her people. She turned a full circle to look each one in the eye, men, women, and children alike. Silence fell around them like a wave erasing all sound, except for nightly insects and animal noises that came from under the trees.
It is time to test the claims of our guests,
she announced.
Tyler Durand.
She inclined her head towards the dragon.
Has graciously volunteered to act as a referee should things get out of hand, along with Sarah.
The gathered mages gave sign of acknowledgement by tilting their chins to the ground. They then stood with legs spaced, shoulders width apart, hands behind their backs. The spectacle reminding Anwen of a military company standing at ease after a parade march on television. They were certainly well trained. Sarah took her cue from Leslie as she moved to stand between the two combatants. She spread her arms out from her sides like a grand orator.
In the time-honored tradition of our forebears, let the odds be kept in line, and may the more skilled mage win. You may begin.
She dropped her arms down to her sides and quickly moved out of the line of fire. After looking around the gathered assembly one last time, Leslie turned back to Anwen. Her hands were clasped behind her back, in a stance not unlike her peers. Her eyes widened, the pupils narrowing as she focused all her attention on her opponent. The air seemed to grow heavier around Anwen. She found her lungs working double time to take in the same amount of air she'd been able to only moments before. It reminded her of what Daphne had done back in the mountain. Images of that encounter flashed through her mind in rapid succession. Weren't they going to shake hands or something before starting? Her soul scars ached with the dull fire, though nothing like when they flared up for real. But it was enough to make her feel sick. Part of her hoped Tyler couldn't feel any of it. She spared part of her energy to block her experience from reaching him. Anwen shuddered, the air growing thinner and thinner around her. Why had Leslie chosen this method for her first attack? But her mind answered for her. Disorient the target. When they were properly distracted, go in with something stronger, just like Daphne had. She forced herself to calm down. It wasn't easy. Memories of the incident threatened to overwhelm her with panic. She wanted to scream but didn't have the breath for it. She closed her eyes to shut out the sight of everything else around her. That usually seemed to work.
Listen,
her mother had told, and she would do everything in her power to do so. She had no weapons and wasn't sure if Leslie did either. Chances were good she did. And if that was the case, she needed to sharpen her focus to a razor edge. Subconsciously, she clenched her fists as she mentally pushed the thin air away. Her efforts created a bubble of fresh air around her. Sweat broke out on Anwen's skin. She never had to exert this much force before, but then again, she never dared go up against this kind of skill before either. Leslie knew what she was doing, more so than Daphne had. The only difference was the emotion behind the attack. Daphne had used malice. Leslie did not. Chest heaving, Anwen moved one hand forward, opening her fingers so the palm faced down. Her whole body trembled as energy flowed up from the ground. The air crackled with it, the sound reminding her of aluminum foil in the microwave. She could smell and feel the heat of it, even though she couldn't see it through her closed eyelids. Walter involuntarily put a hand on Tyler's shoulder as he watched the match. The first few minutes hadn't seemed to give much of a show, except for the strain of muscles. Whatever Leslie was doing had to be on a more mental level, as nothing physical manifested. But then Anwen moved her hand and something odd happened. An almost acrid scent filled the air as energy crackled like trapped lightning in a jar. It almost smelled like burning metallic carrots. The energy didn't quite reach Anwen's hand, nor did it touch the ground. It almost seemed as though the lightning was somehow trapped in the space between them. It grew in intensity as the dull blue turned a more silver-white in color. Wind seemed to kick up from around the Cada as the energy continued to gather. Cracks spread out like shattered glass in a confined space. The space gradually grew smaller and smaller. Spiderweb fragments reached out only to be pulled back in. That's when Walter reached one hand to touch Tyler's shoulder. He had a good guess what that energy was and had some decided misgivings about it.
Tyler?
He nudged again.
How on earth did Anwen learn how to make any map?
Tyler leaned forward and narrowed his eyes to double-check his friend's claim. It took him only a moment to realize he was right, though he couldn't help but wonder how Walter had known. Anwen had essentially created a small fragment of the substance, using the air to enclose it. The energy inside reacted with the desire to exit the enclosure, but she wasn't letting it.
I have no idea,
He responded, his knees turning a bit spongy with shock. Leslie looked uncertain as she watched Anwen focus her energy. The expression was fleeting, but she still took a partial step back as the girl opened her eyes. She stared into irises of pure gold that roiled as if actually filled with living lava. Her eyes went wider at the realization of what the fledgling mage had created.
Hit the deck!
She yelled. Hearing her words, Tyler ran towards Anwen with the speed of lightning. A sonic boom filled the air as he encompassed her creation with his body, holding it in a second larger sphere. The second sphere shattered almost on impact as the smaller one expanded. Despite this, he somehow managed to absorb most of the blast. Unfortunately, there was still enough energy to send everyone flying back, including Tyler and Anwen. A rush of air filled the sudden void, though no one seemed able to hear it as the initial blast had deafened them all. The sudden breeze blew shingles from the nearby roofs and bent trees almost in half. And then there was silence as everyone lay stunned on the ground. Being further from the blast than most of the others, Walter was the first to recover, albeit on shaky limbs. He pushed himself up from the ground, shaking his head. When that didn't seem to help restore his sense of hearing, he knocked his head a few times on the side with one hand.
Ooh!
He exclaimed, a lot louder than he'd planned. The blast left his ears ringing.
Dang, girl!
Leslie was the next to sit up. Shock scrawled across her face. The force had pushed her back towards Walter. She blinked a few times as if not sure her eyes were working as they should. She tried to stand but failed, her limbs unwilling to cooperate.
What in the great cosmos was that?
She couldn't help but stare at Anwen's prone form with awe. Tyler pushed over to an upright position, groaning. His shirt had burned through the front, exposing his chest, which was darkened by soot. He fumbled to stay in an upright sitting position, looking more than a little worse for wear. All around, the other mages moved to standing positions like sluggish toddlers. Sarah made her way to her leader on unsteady legs, practically throwing herself at Leslie's feet.
Walker!
She called out. With the help of her second-in-command, Leslie stood.
I'm fine.
She responded, though her limbs still shook.
Thank you. Sarah.
She took a moment to observe her people. She closed her eyes in concentration to use her abilities to ease the symptoms from those around her. If they felt anything similar to how she did, she knew they'd need the extra effort. As the villagers began to recover, Leslie let her body sag. It took her a moment to realize Anwen had not yet moved. She made her way to the Kata's side, Sarah right beside her. They arrived at the same time as Tyler.
Is she dead?
She asked, her heart thudding in her chest, eyes filled with concern. Tyler shook his head.
No. If she was, I'd be dead too.
He left that thought in the air as he gathered Anwen into his lap, surprised he wasn't feeling what she did. He put one hand over her heart and the other on her forehead as he closed his eyes. Light shone from under his palms, though it didn't last long as he let out a sigh of relief.
She's just stunned.
Walter made his way over to his two friends.
Man, that was some kind of show.
He scratched at the back of his neck.
Sure makes me wish I had a video camera. Oh, no one's gonna believe this.
Leslie glanced over at Walter as she continued to crouch by Anwen and Tyler's side.
It was, wasn't it?
She looked thoughtful.
I didn't know it was possible for someone to do that. She must hold a great amount of power inside.
A scary amount of power.
Walter agreed.
That doesn't even begin to cover it, though.
He gave her a wry glance.
Why, when we first started on this crazy journey, she actually detected a landslide before Tyler did. She somehow managed to coax the water to shoot us down river like a cannon. She then got us over a waterfall without so much as a tremble. Of course, she passed out right after.
The walker seemed to regard Anwen with new insight. She pursed her lips. Apparently, there was a lot more to this girl than met the eye.
I cannot deny your claim of her heritage.
She admitted as she stood.
Not after such a display.
Tyler looked up at her words.
I wish it hadn't taken such an extreme display of power to do it.
He sighed, tracing one finger across Anwen's cheek.
While she has a lot of power inside, she still doesn't know how to use it. If I hadn't interceded, chances are good we'd all have evaporated from that blast. As things stand, I'm gonna need a bit of time to recover from it. I'm sure she will as well.
Leslie bent to touch Tyler lightly on the shoulder. She closed her eyes for several long seconds before breaking contact with him.
Looks like you've broken a rib or two. I'm not sure how dragons heal, but if you want, I can give you a bit of a boost.
But Tyler shook his head.
I just need some rest. My body will heal on its own. I've had worse, believe me. Besides, I'm sure you're more than spent yourself.
He gave her an odd smile, wincing as he moved.
Yes, rest would be nice.
Very well.
Leslie agreed with a nod of her head.
If you'll follow me, I can show you to a place where you can rest.
She turned and stared across the courtyard. Sarah took Anwen so Tyler could stand, carrying her with ease. She then followed Leslie as the walker led them to one of the houses past the square. Walter followed, hoping there'd be beds enough for all of them. He was more than ready to call it a night.